Foundations of Flame, the ninth adventure in the Shackled City campaign path. This adventure was originally published in Dungeon Magazine 113. It is a 30-page adventure for characters of 16th level, although 15th level characters will work fine. This adventure is the second of three adventures that are closely tied to each other, the first being Lords of Oblivion, where the player characters finally confront and defeat Orbius Valantru, a beholder that has taken on aspects of Shatar Demodans, who's also the Lord Mayor. So this adventure deals with the aftermath of that, but also the destruction of Cauldron, or the near destruction of the city. As you can see by this image, this is the red dragon Hook-faced, a dragon that lives in the vicinity as the city is being destroyed due to the earthquakes, fires, and various other events that are taking place in Cauldron, and as the people of Cauldron have to flee, although they may not want to. Player characters must decide who will become the new Lord Mayor, possibly one of them, and interact with the various nobilities right as the city falls into turmoil. And then we'll have to deal with the different events that are happening in the city to try to save the population, and then deal with a sudden dragon attack by Hookface in the end of the adventure. Now, this adventure was written by Chris Thomason, artwork by Udon, Ben Hune, Chris Stevens, Christine Chow, and Jim Zubkovic. Once again, the cartography is done by Christopher West. Now, as you're looking into the adventure, you get the standard information on the background of the city. This does involve the Shackleborn, but the Cage Rights plot to use the Shackleborn to open a giant portal to Carceri, and the after effects of the Cage Rights doing this, which are happening all over the city, thus creating earthquakes, releasing fires, causing demodans to appear in the city. I recommend running the beginnings of this adventure in many cases while you begin running Lords of Oblivion. The events are closely tied together, and it will conclude with the follow-up adventure as well, which will end up being largely a dungeon crawl. Now, the beginning of the adventure is called The Meeting of Minds, and it largely deals with the aftermath of Orbius Valantru being slain by the player characters. Jenny Arrakis summons the player characters, likely to her temple, along with many other nobles, to elect a new Lord Mayor. Now, as you go here, you're given some information on the nobles that will be in attendance, such as Lord Enkin Tascaril and some others. I have recommended in prior videos that some of these individuals be introduced early because it is a major introduction and there are a lot of NPCs that come into play at this moment. This section of the adventure is a complex role-playing meeting. If anyone has played the adventure Rise of Tiamat, it is kind of similar to the Council of Waterdeep scenes, which might happen multiple times in that campaign. In this case, the player characters are going to meet a large number of NPCs, so again, if you introduce some of them early, in say the last adventure or maybe one or two before, it's easier to run this segment of the adventure. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of introductions to do. And I would recommend that each character you show their portrait so players get an idea of what they look like, introduce them and kind of their personality, as well as their relation to the player characters, such as, for example, if the player characters have encountered one of the Vanderboren twins before or have had some association with their family. It does make sense if some of the player characters might be related to some of these individuals. Like maybe one of the player characters is distantly related to Lord Taskerhill and thus has some strong connection to this adventure. In order to do that, of course, you have to have the player characters have an earlier connection very early in the campaign, maybe even the first adventure. Now, going back in here, we get more characters. We get Lord Zachary Alaskan, another important noble in the city. We get Lady Ophelia Nolern. She owns the Drunken Morkoth. These are people the player characters, again, may have encountered or at least should have encountered during the campaign already, maybe in the background, or maybe they've just heard of them. You also get a list of other NPCs who were from prior adventures. Many of these NPCs, if they are still alive, should be at this meeting, and each of the player characters who will be there, including every NPC, should have a vote as to who the next Lord Mayor might be. And again, it could be one of the player characters. It could just simply be one of these nobles, like some of these nobles want to become the next Lord Mayor themselves. And many of these NPCs are already going to have an idea of who they might vote for, but the player character's interactions with them might change their opinion. In fact, the adventure even notes in many cases that they favor certain individuals already. Now, if the player characters have, for example, say they are good friends with Senshin Cyril and she's maybe an NPC character of theirs, she might be easily swayed towards one of the player characters. The DM might want to have a Vice Lord Mayor also elected. I did this in my campaign. I called it the Lord Mayor and Absentee, just so there's a little more of a vote from the just initial vote, and that it gives, in case one of the player characters is not voted Lord Mayor, maybe one of them becomes the Vice Lord Mayor. And this is also a great example of bringing back NPCs that are somewhat memorable from other adventures, such as Mavu or Christoph Jurgensen. He's the sort of the only cleric, a high-level cleric of Pelor, who might have shown up earlier. Keegan Gelv, the gnome from Gel's Locks, and then different NPCs like different merchants in the city that are going to have had a major role in other adventures that can come back for good reason. Now, there might be some additional allies as well that come in, but in the end of this segment, the player characters are going to have to make a vote along with everyone else. It's very open ended as to how or who the player characters vote for and who ends up as the Lord Mayor. But whoever it is, there should be consequences because of that. In my campaign, one of the player characters, who I've mentioned before, a centaur barbarian, became Lord Mayor. The result is he moved towards anarchy, more or less, with the city guard being already having attacked them several times. More or less became less and less important, and he wanted to keep order in his own way. One of my other player characters also became Lord Mayor and Absentee, who was also sort of on the side of chaos. There were results as a result. The city, after this adventure, became more and more chaotic for different reasons. But based on what your player characters choose to do and who they vote for, go along with that and just run with it. And trust me, it'll make a more interesting campaign no matter what happens. Now, during these events, the player character, not necessarily the player characters, but Lord Taskerhill is being scried on by a powerful derro savant. Technically, he's a sorcerer, and his name is Kravi Chak Ryolg. This is his image right here, an amusing image of a derro. Kind of looks like a drow a little bit, so maybe he's like half drow, who knows. But he also has a group of derro barbarians with him. Now, I would recommend if you want to build this in 5th edition, you could just make him as a derro version of a mage if you just want to play it easy, or you could do just a custom build as a 13th level sorcerer. For his followers, if you're running in 5th edition, you could just build them as berserkers, but just make them derro so they get some of the derro traits that are easy to find from one of the, I don't think they're in the Monsters Manual, but they're in one of the companion books that have come out since then. There are a number of different derro builds you could use as well if you don't want to use berserkers. But this fight should involve the people that are at the meeting. Now, some of the people in the meeting are quite powerful. For example, if Christoph Jurgensen is there, he's a 5th level cleric. He should have a presence in the meeting and he could aid in the fight. Some of the NPCs there may leave the meeting right as it adjourns when this attack takes place, and it might actually make it easier to run. This battle is kind of difficult to run, by the way, because there are so many NPCs present, and some of them have some power behind them. The DM might decide or might want to add a few extra derro there as well, just to make the fight more complicated. Instead of having a half dozen enemies, maybe there could be some additional derro that just show up just to be fodder and get in the way. Maybe like a dozen or two random low level derro that are just causing problems to make things more difficult. There could also be someone in the group of NPCs that is not what they seem and turns against everyone and uses that as an opportunity for some third agenda. Who knows? But otherwise, it can be kind of a complicated fight to run. If you've already used a map for, or one design for the Temple of St. Cuthbert, you might want to use it again because it should be familiar ground. In my campaign, Genurakis actually got killed in the battle, and so did Senshen, and it led to a lot of consequences down the line. And since some important NPCs died, there was a little bit more weight to the battle afterwards. Now, the second part of the adventure, which is called the Mountain Wakes, is probably the most complicated version or part of the adventure, and it's the most difficult to run. It's a series of events that take place. They don't have to take place in any particular order. There are a number fires and earthquakes and different events like that that will take place. I recommend maybe having the player characters deal with some side quests during this time. They don't have to take place within 1 hour. It could be like an event that happens over the next like 2 days while the player's in the city. But these events are going to happen, although you don't have to use all of them in your campaign. I didn't use all of them. I thought a lot of them were kind of redundant, but their player characters are largely going to be hired by someone or asked by someone to help the citizens leave the city. And it might be just convincing some of the citizens as a group to leave. It might be dealing with an angry mob. It might be dealing with various hazards, which the player characters should deal with. I would also recommend showing all the images here to the player characters. They are really good images of the fires and the people fleeing. And it should be quite serious that, if the players don't deal with this, if the people don't leave the city, they might die. And it might be really rough. Oh no, my player characters didn't deal with a lot of the evacuation as they had prior information that led them to the follow up adventure, which dealt with I won't go into detail, but a very large dungeon crawl roughly underneath the city. So the player characters should help the people if they can. It's not the end of the world if they don't do a lot of this. And like I said, you don't really need to do every single segment in this adventure. There's some information about modifiers for trying to convince commoners to leave. You could have the player characters encounter a large group of commoners, or another idea is just maybe they encounter some NPCs that they know who don't want to leave right away, and have the player characters interact with them and convince them to leave, and maybe use this chart to help them check. Once again, you get the map of Cauldron, which is definitely going to come to play here, as there's a lot of events that are just happening around the city, and there's again a lot of role playing taking place. There's some possible escape routes, the easy routes out of the city through the city gates. As you're going in here, you get the different, well, things that might happen. Here's a commoner build. You could just use commoners from fifth edition. On the monstrous manual. Different types of hazards the player characters might encounter. These are from third edition, obviously, but this is easily convertible to fifth edition. Just different hazards and traps from whatever DM's guide you're using. You could just use like a fireball for, say, this steam vent as an example. It works fine. But if you're going to have the player characters rescuing people, have some of these hazards take place during the events. And there's, like I said, don't use all the events that are going to come into play. You don't need them all. There's quite a lot of them, and some of them are kind of redundant. For example, the upper story, there's like a tenement that's going to collapse, and there's people in the tenement that can't get out. I would suggest if you run this, break it down to 4 minutes, and every minute something happens. The player characters arrive in the first minute, people are crying for help. Minute 2, part of the building collapses, or maybe there's an explosion. Minute 3, maybe another event or hazard takes place. And minute 4, the entire building collapses no matter what the player characters do, but hopefully get the people out. It might be one of those things where you combine this with the sudden appearance of a demodand, such as the falling Farastu, which happens later. Because a lot of these events are more saving random people and it might get really redundant, I would recommend combining some of them, especially with hazards or some of the more hostile battles that take place later. It's going to be a lot more interesting than just rescuing commoners left and right, which is going to get very redundant really fast. Again, trapped townsfolk is one of them. You get here squished, a major crack splits in the road. A city of flame. It's just a major fire that takes place. This is more hazards that takes place around the area. You could, like I said, do a little side quest, whereas this event takes place during the side quest, so the players don't have a lot of time to complete the side quest. The Lake of Fire deals with a small sort of islet amongst a bunch of lava where some commoners get stuck on the islet and the player characters need to rescue them if they can. Different events happening. Here's one involving a bunch of animals in the city that might need to be rescued. This would be great if one of your player characters is a druid, for example, or just really loves animals. That's the Stampede. There's an Angry Elemental in this case. It's an Elder Elemental. You can find stats for that if you're playing 5th edition that are homebrew online. This is similar to an event that happens in a prior adventure, so it's kind of redundant because you fight Elder Elementals, again, 2 of them, in one of the prior adventures. But it does work for this adventure considering the situation. There's an angry mob, which is just a bunch of commoners, and then in 3rd edition, they just make it as a gargantuan mob, like a swarm of commoners. The player characters or the DM, if you want, could just build them as a gargantuan mob of commoners, like a swarm, and it would be really interesting as a battle. And 3 mobs that really just cannot be reasoned with, and the player characters have to deal with. It might be kind of challenging, and it's kind of morally gray that what happens when the player characters have to kill these people because they just won't listen. Or maybe the player characters are able to magically subdue them because why would they want to kill these people if they don't have to, unless they're just murder hobos who just want XP for it? Likely, this kind of situation would be very interesting, but depends on the group how they handle it. As you get further in, there's a gas explosion. This is kind of like one of those gas fireballs I mentioned earlier. And then further in, you get the urban avalanches where buildings are literally collapsing, especially because Cauldron is built like a bowl into toward the actual lake. There could be a lot of bludgeoning damage as buildings collapse, and it could be during a battle. In fact, I would actually recommend that, like they're fighting something in the streets, like maybe that fire elemental, and suddenly on a certain round that the DM designates ahead of time, or like a random round, the building next to them just collapses on top of them, and it's a huge surprise. It's way more interesting than just having this happen at random. Have it happen during the fire elemental fight, for example, or while they're fighting a random demo dand in the city, and they never see it coming, and it's much more interesting than running this by itself. One of the actual encounters here is the falling Farastu, who just pops out of nowhere and essentially lands with a wet thump in the middle of the streets. He like falls out of a loose crack between the mortal plane and Carceri. And there's another encounter. I think this is, I don't remember if this is a Shaitar or a Farastu or a Calabar. It's not a Shaitar, it's one of the other two. There's a descending Calabar. In fact, I think he's a Calabar because he's got wings, and who descends out of another hole in the sky from when the portal is starting to open and starts trying to grab people and imprison them. Since Demo Dans are all about imprisoning people, they might be attacking certain people, but they're more about taking prisoners and like forcing them into imprisonment situations because they're basically fiendish jailers. And that's what Carceri is. It's the prison plane of existence. Now, as the players are coming further into the adventure, again, more events taking place. It just kind of goes into it. If the player characters haven't dealt with the Morkoth that's in the Crater Lake, you could use the Morkoth Rising, but if they've already killed it, you don't have to do it. I'd recommend saying that the water temperature in the lake is increasing, especially if there's a character that is like a sea elf. That happened in my campaign where the sea elf character was noticing the temperature change in the water over a period of time. Eventually, the lake starts boiling, and eventually, this Morkoth is not going to want to stay there because his life is threatened. It might even come onto land. Many of these events might have already happened, or there might be a similar event that it might have happened. If that's happening in your campaign, like you've done a Morkoth battle already as a side quest, you don't need to do it again. And again, if some of these events seem like something you've already done that you think is too redundant, don't use it. You don't need to use them all. I feel like some of them are too redundant, and you could easily merge 2 or 3 of them together, and it's going to be much more interesting because brevity is the soul of wit in this case. Now, there are some Vrocs that attack. They're They can attack. Maybe they somehow got in Carceri and broke out. It's another one of those encounters. It might work really well in combination with something else. But this is largely what this adventure is. This is sort of the meat and potatoes of the adventure. It also makes it kind of difficult to run because it's just a lot of different events. And again, some of them are kind of weak by themselves. So, like I said, look through them, merge some of them together. I would actually even maybe have some of them take place during Lords of Oblivion, which like maybe the rock attack happens, or like a fire elemental attack, or there's an earthquake and a building collapse, or there's a gas explosion. Just sort of use some of those instead of having them happening all at once as sort of foreshadowing as to what's about to happen in this adventure if you're running Lords of Oblivion first. Now, as you get to the end of the adventure, you encounter, or the player characters will have encountered Hookface. He's an adult red dragon. In a prior adventure, as the players were heading into the jungle, they encountered a young red dragon who is, I believe, an offspring of this dragon. And the issue I have with this is in the follow-up adventure to this adventure, the player characters are going to encounter another adult red dragon called Molten Wing. And this is one of those issues with this particular adventure where there's a little bit of redundancy. The player characters are going to get into the next adventure and be like, oh, another adult red dragon. We just fought one of those. I feel like in this case, as a DM, you don't need to keep putting red dragons against the player characters, or if you do so, do it wisely. In this case, I didn't even use Hookface in this case because I felt like, oh, we're going to fight Molten Wing in the next adventure anyways. It's redundant. So you could have the Molten Wing or Hookface attack, or you want to be really difficult with your player characters, say they're higher level than expected, have them both attack. The players will be really surprised to having to do or having to encounter two adult red dragons in the same time. It could be that perhaps maybe they kill one of the dragons, but the other one teleports away because dragons can use spells, or has some magic item that helps them get away back to Molten Wing's lair, which comes into play in the next adventure. Using it the way it is going to be way too redundant, and you could switch out Hookface for, say, another enemy. Like maybe instead of using a red dragon, you bring in a green dragon. It's a little different, but again, using double dragons at once is going to be a serious challenge, and it's going to be kind of a unique encounter instead of the standard one dragon encounter. And then again, maybe both dragons are fairly intelligent. Maybe they don't fight to the death. Maybe they get bloodied at half hit points and they flee at that point. And it could be a follow up quest that like player characters have to go out to Hookface's lair to try to finally deal with him. My player characters actually went there and ransacked his lair. He wasn't there at the time. I think I had told the player characters Hookface was the younger dragon out of confusion, and so the actual dragon Hookface, whoever he ended up being, never showed up, or might have just been gone at that time. Now, as you're concluding the adventure, again, this adventure ends once the dragon is defeated, but it really is part of a three-part series, so the adventure is going to really conclude as you go into the next adventure, which is again going to take the players underground into a ladder dungeon crawl, which lies not far. It's really close, and I believe underneath Cauldron. Now, overall, this is probably the weakest of all the Shackled City's adventures, mostly because there's a lot of redundant stuff that happens that is kind of brought back, fire elemental, elder fire elemental specifically, and having a red dragon, an adult red dragon in this adventure and in the next one, it kind of makes the adventure kind of weak and just too redundant. And many of the events that take place are kind of weak events by themselves, and they might actually be kind of boring. So how many times can you rescue commoners? So in many times, you need to actually combine a lot of things in this adventure to make it better. As a result, overall, I'd rate this as a 3.5 out of 5. Like I said, one of the weakest reviews I've given for any of the Shackled City adventures. Now, don't fret, as the follow-up adventure, I will give a way higher review. I will say this, it's a large dungeon crawl and it's very dangerous. I'll also show some of my own maps for the adventure. Um, Most of the maps, if you're running them online for this adventure, the DM will likely end up reusing different maps, area maps in the city. such as some of the adventure can take place near the mayor's house that was used in an earlier adventure, or some of it might take place in by the drunken Morkoth, which the DM's probably used by then. If you're running it in person, you don't have to do things like that. But if you're running it online, you will likely have the opportunity, will need to reuse a lot of old maps because the players are just going to retread old ground a lot, which again is kind of one of the flaws in this adventure as well. Now, guys, if you like these reviews and you want to see more of them, please like and please subscribe. I will end up reviewing the rest of the Shackled City campaign modules and then some further campaign adventures and modules down the line.